How we choose to govern artificial intelligence has become a defining geopolitical challenge of our time. And as this technology reshapes our world, we're seeing three leading powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, and China, charting starkly divergent paths for its control.
And that's the core of what we're exploring today. The US, UK, and China have each developed competing and frankly incompatible models for AI governance. And these aren't just minor policy tweaks. They represent fundamental philosophical disagreements about the role of technology, the economy, and the state itself. So, here's how we're going to break this down. We'll start by profiling each nation's approach, beginning with the United States. Then we'll hop over to the United Kingdom, and finally, China. And we'll wrap up with a comparative analysis to really unpack the profound implications of these competing visions for the future.
All right, let's dive into the United States. The American approach to AI is really a story of deep tension. A conflict between a federal market-first philosophy on one hand and a growing fragmented patchwork of state-level actions on the other. The foundational concept here is a market-first model. The federal idea is to prioritize technological dominance, mostly through deregulation. Now, enforcement is ex post, which is just a fancy way of saying action is usually taken after a harm has already occurred. For companies trying to navigate this, the result is an incredibly complex and often contradictory compliance landscape.
You can really see this instability in the dramatic policy whiplash that's happened at the executive level. In late 2023, the White House was focused on managing societal risks like bias, but by 2025, that entire framework was tossed out in favor of aggressive deregulation. The very definition of harm was completely reframed.
Let's just look at that shift. The 2023 view saw harm in societal terms, things like discrimination, in technical terms, like national security threats. The 2025 paradigm, though, redefines harm as ideological, combating so-called woke AI, and economic. Suddenly, the biggest risk is seen as regulation itself. This kind of instability has become a core feature of the U.S. federal approach.
So, with this vacuum at the federal level, the states have jumped in, creating what everyone's calling a regulatory patchwork. And their philosophies are really different. You've got Colorado, for instance, focused on high-risk systems and things like hiring, mandating a duty of care. But then there's California, which is targeting the most powerful frontier models to head off catastrophic risks. And of course, a company has to figure out how to navigate both.
Now let's turn our attention to the United Kingdom. They're attempting to forge a unique third way. It's a really strategic post-Brexit effort to build a flexible and pro-innovation environment that's different from what both the US and the EU were doing.
The UK's model is deliberately agile and state-facilitated. Instead of creating one single, rigid AI law, it empowers existing expert regulators in finance and communications, you name it, to interpret a set of high-level principles. It's really designed to adapt as the technology changes, using its post-Brexit freedom to avoid that rigid EU-style legislation.
And these are the 5 guiding principles for those UK regulators. Now, what's crucial to understand is that they are initially non-binding or non-statutory. The whole idea is to provide a coherent framework that doesn't stifle innovation, allowing each regulator to decide what fairness, for example, really means in their specific sector.
This flexible approach has already had to evolve. The UK now effectively operates a 2-track system. For most mainstream AI, that principles-based approach is still the rule. But for the most powerful frontier models, the government sees a totally different level of risk. So it's moving toward binding legislation focused on national security, all managed by its new AI Security Institute.
The UK's pro-innovation stance isn't just talk either. They're actively facilitating it through things like regulatory sandboxes. You can think of this as a controlled environment where a company can test a new AI product with certain rules relaxed. And if the test goes well, the government can use that real-world evidence to justify permanently reforming outdated regulations.
Okay, now we turn to China, and its framework presents a really stark contrast to the Western models we've been looking at. What we see here is a top-down, state-centric architecture of, well, total control. China's model is defined by a dual imperative. On one hand, the goal is to achieve global AI supremacy. On the other, it's to maintain absolute state control over information and social stability. This leads to an ex-ante control regime, which just means before the fact. So, unlike in the US, control is mandatory, and it happens before a product can even dream of reaching the market.
When it comes to generative AI, the obligations are incredibly strict and completely non-negotiable. The providers are legally responsible for everything their models produce. All content has to align with core socialist values, and all users have to be identified by their real names. This is not a set of guidelines, it's a list of absolute requirements.
This mandatory process is how they create that control. Before any public release, a model has to pass a state security assessment and be registered with the government. When you combine that with real-name user IDs and mandatory watermarking, you get a closed-loop system where the state can trace any piece of AI-generated content right back to the user who created it and the company that produced it.
So, let's bring these 3 case studies together. A direct comparison doesn't just reveal different rules, it reveals fundamentally irreconcilable philosophies with major strategic consequences for any global company.
This table really lays it out clearly. In the US, you have a market-driven philosophy with a fragmented legal approach and diffused power. In the UK, it's state-facilitated with a bifurcated, principles-based system. And then in China, it's state-centric with a mandatory, top-down approach where all power is concentrated in a single regulator, the CAC.
And if we focus on just the most powerful models and innovation, the differences are even sharper. The US is market-led. The UK positions the state as a tester and an evaluator. And China positions the state as a censor with pre-market approval. It's the same with innovation, market-driven in the US, state-facilitated in the UK, and state-directed in China.
For a global company, this means compliance isn't one problem, it's 3 distinct, expensive, and difficult challenges. In the US, you have the burden of fragmentation, trying to navigate 50 different state laws. In the UK, it's the burden of ambiguity, waiting for regulators to define what the principles actually mean in practice. And in China, it's the burden of stringency, adhering to total, costly rules of state control.
Which leads us to the critical question. Given these deeply conflicting requirements, especially the clash between China's mandate for core socialist values and the 2025 US policy pushing for ideological neutrality, can one global AI model even exist anymore?
The evidence strongly suggests that the answer is no. We are entering the era of the splinter net of AI. The dream of a single global technology stack seems to be over. Instead, AI development is fracturing along these geopolitical lines, forcing companies to build different models for different regulatory blocks.
And this is really the ultimate takeaway. For anyone operating in this space, success is no longer just about building the best algorithm. A winning global strategy has to be designed not for one market, but for 3 fragmented and increasingly hostile regulatory and political worlds. The future of AI will be shaped just as much by these geopolitical forces as it will be by technological innovation.